This is Whiskey Whereabouts. I'm Tim, and if you've been looking for some ideas for some Scotch whiskies to try after those gateway sort of foundational whiskeys, the Glenfiddich 12 years, the Glenlivet, Glenmorangie 12 years, I'm going to give you my list of top 5 choices that are whiskeys that are a step up from those sort of Glens 12 that are all less expensive than that Macallan 12-year bottle on the shelf down at the shop. My whiskey journey has taken me to Scotland and back. I've explored whiskey education, tastings, and distilleries from Islay to Speyside. And now my journey continues here, with you, on Whiskey Whereabouts. So this is a topic we've been talking about on the channel throughout February, sort of gateway whiskeys or our first Scotch whiskey loves. I did a whole video. I'll put a link up here so you can check it out if you haven't seen it. Talking about the results of some polls. I had a poll for my subscribers here on the channel, my followers on Instagram, put the results up, and then I reviewed my sort of first sort of gateway Scotch whiskey, Glenlivet 12 year. And now talking about the next steps. You know, where do we go from there on our journey? And honestly, there's just so many Scotch whiskeys, and you can go in any direction. There certainly aren't any rules, and what I have tried to do is choose a list of 5 bottles that are a step up in presentation and in quality from those sort of big entry-level names with a sort of eye toward some overlap, some common ground here in terms of the flavors or just the sort of character of these whiskeys. We're doing all unpeated whiskeys today. We'll come back and do, you know, Lafroy 10 or something later on. So I lied, of course. We're not only going to do 5. Every time I do one of these lists, I always do honorable mentions. And so I'm going to start the honorable mentions with a whiskey that I reviewed very recently on the channel. It's this whiskey, and it's distinctive blue bottle, the classic Laddie. It's a non-age statement whiskey, but it is very well presented. And there's a couple of reasons it didn't make the list. It is a bourbon forward with a wide variety of wine casks. In the case of those that Glenfiddich and Glenlivet 12 years we're talking about, bourbon and sherry matured whiskey, primarily though with that sort of orchard fruit and bourbon cask flavors forward. Not very big sort of sherried whiskeys, even if that influence is there. And here we have another whiskey with a lot of bourbon influence and then some wine influence. Why didn't it make a list? A couple of reasons. Number one, 50% ABV. That's a big step up from those 40% Glens. And you can always add a little bit of water, but that's a big jump, and it could be a little hot as a first sort of move. The second thing is Bruichladdich has a distinctive sort of element to their character. It is that lactic butyric acid sort of note. It's a note, if you're not from the US, that is sort of known to be an American chocolate. It's a note that we have a lot of colorful descriptions for. That's the one where we talk about the baby vomit. It's an analogy, but and it's nicely balanced in this whiskey, as it is in a lot of the Bruichladdich. But it's there. It could rub you the wrong way. There's a whole thing about the age of this whiskey. It took me 2 videos to cover that. Make sure you check it out. I'll put a link up here. But the bottom line is, it doesn't have an age statement. Go on the website. You can find the same basic information you could if it did. It's probably only about 7-8 year whiskey, depending on your bottle. Check with the code. Check the website. So it's also younger than you probably used to with that sort of 12 year. The price on those Glens, it's going to vary. I see it, you know, from about $40 all the way to $50. They're everywhere. A lot of opportunities to pick them up in different sort of channels. So you may get a different price, but you're talking about at least another sort of $10 on this. One more honorable mention before the list proper, and this one is not a Speyside whiskey like the classic Laddie, which is an Islay whiskey. This is an island whiskey, but it's from a different island called Mull, and it's Tobermory 12 year. A bourbon matured whiskey again, and that is not disqualifying. We're going to get further along the list, and we'll see. Again, it's missing that sort of sherry element that we expect from those sort of gateway Glens, and it is a little bit island. It has a little bit of a different sort of quality to it. It isn't going to be quite as subtle and reserved as those sort of Speyside big Glens, and so it's certainly one to look for. It may be one more step just because it's throwing a few curveballs, but it's out there, and it's a whiskey that should probably cost, if you can find it, less than $10 more, probably, $5 to $10. And for that, you're getting 46.3% properly presented, non-chill filtered, no color added whiskey. Starting off the list with number 5, it's Whiskey Tube's favorite entry-level whiskey, Deanston 12 years. This is not Speyside whiskey, it's Highland whiskey, and it is bourbon matured whiskey. So similar to those first two, it's missing that sort of sherry component, but it really does have the sort of vanilla, sort of apple orchard elements. I think it probably has a little bit more tropical sort of fruit element than the Glenlivet that I just reviewed, but we've got a lot of overlap. And again, we've got a nice 46.3% ABV here. It's not chill filtered, there's no color added, it's properly presented whiskey. And in terms of price tag, we're probably looking, depending, again, there's some factors on those big sort of Glenlivet, Glenfiddichs, but we're probably looking at about $10 more. And so you are paying for more whiskey, literally. You're going to 46 rather than 40%. Next up, another island whiskey. We haven't been to Speyside yet. This one is another sort of darling of this sort of entry-level category, but it's going to be a little bit younger. And this is a whiskey from Arran 10 year, and it is an island whiskey. It's not peated. I don't think of it as very super salty, the way some island whiskey, coastal kind of quality elements to it. I think of it as more floral and probably a little bit more tropical than those Glenlivet, Glenfiddich types, but it is bourbon and sherry matured. It's going to be, the 46%, it's going to be properly presented. Like all of the whiskeys I'm talking about, there is just going to be more richness of a flavor, just more robust. And this is another one, it's a little harder to find, than certainly than those Glens and maybe in that Deanston, depending on where you are. But again, it's not going to be crazy expensive. I would say $5 to $10 more, probably. Again, it's hard to tell because the price on those big Glenlivets, Glenfiddichs floats a little bit, but not an enormous jump here. You're getting fewer years in the warehouse, but you're getting more whiskey, 46%, you're getting the proper presentation. We finally reached Speyside, and this is another one that's going to go kind of the other way. Had a couple that were just bourbon matured, and now we're going to go and lean in to the sherry. This is Glenallachie, the entry-level 8 years. It's got that complex Glenallachie casks, PX sherry, Oloroso sherry, some virgin oak, and some red wine casks. This is going to be much more sweet. It's going to be much more sherry than those Glenfiddich, Glenlivet type of whiskeys, and you're only getting 8 years in the warehouse. But you're going to get 46% in a properly presented whiskey. If you are not already familiar, Glenallachie was a distillery that produced whiskey that basically just went into blends. They're in Speyside, and they were purchased by a gentleman named Billy Walker. If you don't know him, you can look him up, but he has huge credibility in the Scotch whiskey industry. Let's leave it at that. And this distillery has sort of turned into one that has a lot of sort of interest and appreciation in the sort of whiskey enthusiast community as a result of his influence and the way that they are holding their whiskey out. The thing about it is we haven't even gotten the stock that was actually distilled under the current ownership, hasn't aged into these whiskeys just yet. We're getting there, we're getting close. I'm gonna say less than $10 more. Again, you're trading years in the warehouse for younger whiskey, but you're getting more whiskey. You're getting less water in the bottle, you're getting more whiskey, it's 46%, and it's well presented. And as a result, you may get a little bit more youth in a sort of 8-year whiskey than you're accustomed to, but you're getting just so much more robust, sort of rich flavor. We're going to stay in Speyside for the next whiskey. It's another bourbon and sherry matured whiskey, so a lot of overlap. It's also going to be a year older, so we're going to have a 13-year whiskey. You may be nodding already and you know where we're going. Craigellachie 13 year. It's 46% whiskey with non-chill filtered and no color added. It's properly presented whiskey. It's going to have some of that sherry influence, really nice distinctive element that's all its own. You could call it maybe funky. There's a Craigellachie element that elevates this whiskey and makes it distinctive from your sort of more common Speyside whiskey flavors or profile. Is it, maybe not for everyone? Maybe, but it is something that certainly hints at some bigger and more exotic sort of flavor profiles in some whiskeys that are out there, that are beyond. And this one is also not going to break the bank, especially right now. There appears to be a real value, at least here in North America. I've seen discussion of this with the market in Canada and here in the U.S. I mean, here in the U.S., I would expect to pay, less than $10 more. Maybe $5 more. I think it's a little bit more. I jumped on Master Malt to check, and I think in the UK it is more. It's closer to $20 more than what the sort of Glenlivet is listed at. But it is a pretty good value right now. So where will we go for number one? We're leaving Speyside. We're returning to Islay. This is technically an entry-level whiskey, 12-year whiskey properly presented, that just remains worthwhile. That remains a whiskey worth having on your shelf, no matter where you have gone on your journey. A lot of build-up, but this is a whiskey I think that delivers. It's the Bunnahabhain 12-year, a 46.3% bourbon and sherry matured whiskey, and this is one that's going to have some of the sherry spice, going to have some of the honey sweet, a little bit richer, a little bit more concentrated than that sort of vanilla bourbon cask influence on those sort of gateway Glens, but with a specific sort of salty element. This is an island whiskey that has that character, and I think it's a nice element to add to your sort of experience on your palate, offsetting some of those sweeter elements from those sort of traditionally used casks. It's just sort of a sea sort of salt air. It's not a really sort of murky, briny, peaty element, but enough to sort of offset it. It's just a really quality, rewarding whiskey that does not cost nearly as much more as the quality is more than these entry sort of level style whiskeys. I would expect to pay, again, about $10 more. I would expect to get over $60 here in the US on this bottle, whereas I've seen those that Glenlivet poke its head over sort of $50, $10, maybe $12, but a really big step up without having anything really off, anything abrasive or sort of overwhelming. And that's a whiskey that you can really settle in with and return to. It's a whiskey that we often will return and restock because there's just so much quality there for the price tag. And speaking of the Bunnahabhain 12-year, we're coming up on the first Friday in March, and the first Friday in March brings Malt Madness. And it's a different sort of group this year, a little bit more of an accessible group than it was last year. And Bunnahabhain 12, as well as its more robust twin brother, are both in the field. So we are going to start again. First Friday of March will be the first flight, but we may have a sort of an early preview episode may drop out of order. Make sure that you check your notifications for that. Make sure you subscribe. If you haven't, you're not going to want to miss it. This year's tournament is going to be, it's going to be good. And I will see you on the next one.